So Henri de Lubac was a French Jesuit priest in the 20th century. He was born in 1896, died of a stroke in 1991, and he was actually made a cardinal towards the end of his life by John Paul II, who was his good friend. So that was in 1983 that he was made a cardinal. He entered the Jesuits in 1913. However, his formation was disrupted by World War One. So he was actually drafted into the war, fought
Mm.
as a soldier, had some shrapnel in his head for the rest of his life, from a war injury. So he suffered from like these debilitating migraines, from then on.
Mm.
He had to do seminary formation actually in the United Kingdom, because of the anti Catholic government in France at the time. Even after the war, he studied in England, but then returned to France when he was ordained in 1927. And in 1929, he was offered his first job as a professor of theology. And that's also when he gave his first public lecture called Apologetics and Theology. Yeah, so he did that in 1929. And then in 1938, he published his first major work, Catholicism. I brought some props here, like show and tell. So this is Catholicism. And this text, I think it's Ratzinger who calls it programmatic. Really, everything that de Lubac goes on to write is all here in seed form. He eventually served as emeritus at the Second Vatican Council. So he was a theological advisor to several bishops, including Karol Wojtyła, who went on to be JP2, John Paul II. And then after the council, he served on the International Theological Commission alongside of Ratzinger, Balthasar, and Karl Rahner. His final publication was published in 1989, at the Service of the Church, which is really his autobiography. And
Mhm.
again, he died in 1991. He was invited to be emeritus at the Second Vatican Council. So emeritus, it's like a theological advisor, a theological expert there, by John the 23rd.
Mm.
And this was coming after he had been silenced, not by the church. I want to be clear about that, not by the church hierarchy, but by the Jesuit order that he was in. He was silenced in the 1950s. And he was released of that in 1959. And then I think it was actually 1960 that John the 23rd reached out to him and invited him to be
Mm.
part of the Theological Preparatory Commission of Vatican II. So he was part of that preparatory commission. And then again, he served as a theological expert. The parity, these experts were assigned to different bishops. And again, one of the bishops he was assigned to was Wojtyła. I know that he and JP2 struck up a great friendship there. Lubac speaks very fondly of Wojtyła, and Wojtyła really respected de Lubac's influence. They were just tracking with each other in the drafting of the documents.
Yeah.
And again, you see this in John Paul II's, Pope John Paul II's work. The way that he resources the council, I think, is a de Lubacian way of resourcing the council. Again, a focus on
Mm.
Gaudium et Spes and the idea of Christ revealing the Father, revealing man to himself. De Lubac even wrote the foreword actually to then Wojtyła's Love and Responsibility, the French edition of that.
Really?
Um, at any rate, so I know that their friendship developed there, and then de Lubac again, he was an advisor. He has 2-volume Vatican Council notebooks where he talks about his experience at the council. He also has commentaries that he wrote on Dei Verbum and on Lumen Gentium and on Gaudium et Spes. So de Lubac is interesting because, and I think that this is incorrect. I'll start by saying that. But in the first half of his life, people thought of him as a progressive, right? And then
Mhm.
after the council, everybody thought of him as a conservative. I don't think of him as either. He saw himself as traditional in the sense of embracing the whole Catholic tradition and trying to channel that tradition in his writing. It's
Mm.
actually interesting when you read any of his works, he just has so many quotes by church fathers and by Thomas Aquinas. And he says, I just want them to kind of be channeled through me. I want to get out of the way and let the
Yeah.
tradition speak.
Yeah.
But no, absolutely. After the council, he was very disappointed with the way that it was interpreted. And I think that that's part of why he returned to the question of nature and grace in the 1980s with his book, sorry, here we go, Brief Catechesis
Mm.
of Nature and Grace. And it's in this book that, for the first time, he gives a more sustained treatment of his critique of immanentism, because he thought that
Oh.
after the council, that was more of the issue than nature grace extrinsicism, than separating the orders. He thought, oh gosh, now we're collapsing the orders. He thought that the church, in opening to the modern world, was almost, some people in the church were treating the modern world as if it's already graced. So Ratzinger writes the foreword to Catholicism, to the latest edition of Catholicism. And Ratzinger says that Catholicism was a key reading event in his own theological formation.
Mm.
And then Wojtyła, even in Theology of the Body, which you brought up, in Mulieris Dignitatum, John Paul II talking about, the human person being called to make a gift of him or herself, but that's also how we find our personal distinction. And even, John Paul II in the Theology of the Body, he talks about heaven in terms of unity and distinction, the communion of saints in terms of unity and distinction, which De
Oh.
Lubac does as well. De Lubac talks about, again, a healthy marriage as a unity and distinction, and we see that in John Paul II. So certainly, in those two. And then in terms of Balthazar, so Balthazar was at the theological school where De Lubac was teaching. I'm not sure that he actually took classes with him, but he says that he would ask De Lubac for his lecture notes, and De Lubac would give them to him.
That's amazing.
And Balthazar was so grateful to De Lubac for his work that he went on to write a book about De Lubac.
Yeah.
His legacy, I mean, I think it's complicated, right? Because there are
Mhm.
still, I'm writing an article right now about, 10 myths about Henri de Lubac. There's still a lot of confusion about who he was. So people, again, they classify him as progressive, they classify him as a conservative. He's mysterious.
Mhm.
And so I think that there's still work to be done in understanding him. But in terms of his legacy or his influence, again, very influential in John Paul II, Benedict, I see that unity and distinction idea, at least even in Pope Francis. Um,
Mhm.
in Fratelli Tutti, for instance, he relies on that very idea and he links it to the unity and distinction in God. And so I
Mm.
think that we see de Lubac's ideas continuing to unfold. Certainly, there's been a lot of attention given to the nature grace controversy. I think that
Yeah.
more attention needs to be given to the other side of that, which is his critique of immanentism. Um,
Yeah.
I think that his life was certainly very fruitful and has provided a lot for the church to think about. Pius XII, who wrote Humani Generis, many people thought that de Lubac was implicated in Humani Generis.
Mhm.
He denies being implicated there. He doesn't think that the condemnations in Humani Generis apply to him. But in any case, years after that was published, a cardinal told de Lubac, "You should send some of your works to Pius XII for him to read."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Pius XII wrote de Lubac a letter back through the Pope's confessor. And he
Mhm.
just said, "Your work is going to bear tremendous fruit for the church, and you should keep writing."
Wow.
And then, yeah, and Paul VI, for de Lubac's 80th birthday, wrote him a letter saying something very similar. You have done so much work for the church. And John Paul II, I think, confirmed um, all of this by making de Lubac a cardinal. So,
Yes.
um,
And, yeah, I mean, you brought his, service to the church. This is the book here, At the Service of the Church. Henri de Lubac reflects on the circumstances that occasioned his writings. So, audience, get this book and read more de Lubac. He might be challenging sometimes, but not always. He's got some very accessible works. And yeah, we need to deepen our faith and to understand the counsel and implement the counsel in our lives. And that's why I think he's a key figure and an important one that we can really learn from.